Okay, so now that we've talked about Pareto efficiency, there's ways to unpack Pareto efficiency into kind of more specific concepts of efficiency. Okay. So first there's productive efficiency, and this could be essentially Pareto efficiency in the production, in patterns of production. So if you're looking at a production possibility frontier. So goods or services are produced at the lowest possible cost. That is productive efficiency. Being as efficient as possible in production, producing at the lowest cost. So if you have two suppliers and one has a high cost and the other does not, you'd want the low cost supplier to be the one to produce the good. Otherwise, kind of everybody as a whole loses. Okay. So when you assign the wrong comparative advantage, you are not acting productively efficient because the person with the higher opportunity cost in that case will be producing the good, and that will be inefficient. Okay. And we showed that with Kendrick and Marshall, right? And then with Luke and Danny. So you've seen it now a couple times. Okay, allocative efficiency. Production matches consumer preferences. So you're going to produce at a point where marginal cost is equal to marginal benefit. So you're not going to produce goods at a higher cost than the willingness to pay for the person's marginal willingness to pay, basically. So if you can't find a consumer who's willing to consume the good at a higher willingness to pay than it costs you to make the good, then you're not acting allocatively efficient. So this is basically producing until you found someone who is willing to pay less than what it costs you to make the thing. Okay. So allocative efficiency is basically another way of saying the highest willingness to pay people should get the good. Okay. And then if once you've reached the point where there's no high willingness to pay people relative to cost, then you should stop making the good. Okay. So I've used the term marginal cost and marginal benefit, and I've used them quite a lot in this course so far. Okay, right? I use them right here. So anytime I use the word marginal, I've said this like probably 10 times at this point, but marginal is the next additional unit. Marginal just means that the cost of the next additional unit, or the marginal benefit is the benefit from the next additional unit. Okay. So if I say your marginal utility, that's the utility you get from the next additional unit. So when I say you have diminishing marginal utility, that means your utility is going to look like this. As you consume more, the change in utility is going to be lower, even though total utility will increase. So your marginal utility will be decreasing. Okay. So markets promote both allocative and productive efficiencies, but they might have what's called the negative externality. Okay. And it's a big fancy word, but what a negative externality is if there's, let's say there's a buyer, there's a seller, okay, and then unrelated to the buying and the selling, there's a third party who's hurt, okay. The damage done to a person who's not the buyer or seller as a result of the trade will be what's called the negative externality. So imagine I go into a guitar shop and I buy a big old amplifier and the loudest guitar that I can find. Okay, and I live on a 4th floor condo. Okay, so you can imagine how annoying that would be. Okay, I benefit. I get some consumer surplus because I'd probably be willing to pay more than the producer's cost. So I get some consumer surplus, or I'd be willing to pay more than the price. The price is probably greater than the producer's cost, so he gets some producer surplus. So between the buyer and the seller, me and the person at the guitar shop, we've both seen a surplus. But the other people in my condo who have to hear me play, Stairway to Heaven at 4 o'clock in the morning aren't going to be so happy. And this is kind of a true story. I don't play guitar, but I do. I am known to do deadlifts at 5 o'clock in the morning. So the people behind me are probably seeing some negative externality every time I buy a new weight. So negative externality is basically the annoyance that you give to somebody who's not buying or selling the good. Okay. Another example of a negative externality, a big one in today's world. So let's say you're in the grocery store and one of the customers wants to buy apples. Okay. And of course the grocery store wants to sell them apples. But what if the person walks in without a mask, right? What happens? They can infect everybody around them. That is a negative externality. Those people have nothing to do with the buying and the selling of apples, but they are harmed nonetheless. That's a negative externality. Or another example would be, imagine I have a business that produces paper, okay? And every time I produce paper, the steam from the production will leave the atmosphere. It'll stay in the ozone or stay in whatever, and it causes it exacerbates the greenhouse gas effect, right? It exacerbates essentially man-made climate change. That is a case where the buyer and the seller of paper, by virtue of producing the paper, have now caused negative externalities on people who have nothing to do with buying that paper. I will never see that shipment of paper in my life, but nonetheless I am harmed by it. Okay, these are all negative externalities. Alternatively, there's also positive externalities. So, there's every time someone gets a COVID vaccine, which isn't out yet as of today at least. Maybe when you're watching it, it will be. Fingers crossed. But every time someone gets a COVID vaccine, they are now not going to be a carrier of the disease. Okay, so CVS sells you the vaccine, or AstraZeneca or whatever sells you the vaccine. You buy the vaccine, and you are no longer able to carry the disease, so you're no longer able to hurt people around you. That has a positive externality. Okay, or maybe it's just a lack of a negative externality, if you want to look at it that way too. What's another example of positive externalities? How about if I teach you something cool about pricing strategy, then you go on to work at Amazon and you implement your ideas and you save the company money. Okay, you as the student, the buyer of my lectures, and me as the producer of the lectures, the supplier of lectures, engage in a transaction where we both have some sort of surplus. But in addition, Amazon, who has nothing to do with this transaction, and I will never know if you go on to work with Amazon, but if you do, get me a job. But if you work for Amazon and you do them a solid by coming up with better pricing strategies, that is a positive externality from my selling you a lecture. Okay. When I post these lectures onto YouTube, other people can see them. Okay, they're not buying the lecture the way that you are. They are seeing a positive externality. Whether that's great for you who is paying for the lecture, that might be a little more debatable. That's what we call public goods, where they're non-rival, non-excludable. By virtue of me uploading them to Blackboard, they have to be public, so I'm sorry. I can take them down later, maybe, but at least for the duration of this semester, they're going to be public. It is what it is. Okay. So an externality is a transaction that has the effect a transaction has on non-parties to the transaction, people who are not the buyer or the seller. Okay. So I just came up with some positive externalities and negative externalities. Another positive externality is public transportation. When there's an efficient public transportation system, you are decreasing the number of cars on the road, which decreases pollution. You are decreasing transit time for people in traffic, so they're probably willing to thank you for that. You're allowing for further travel if you want to work somewhere further. So your job will thank you for that, even though you as the buyer of public transportation, and let's say SEPTA or PATCO or NJ Transit as the seller of transportation, have nothing to do with the other people on the road. They have nothing to do with your employer. Okay, that's a positive externality. And I just talked about pollution and vaccination.